Welcome to Lund University, Sweden, and this evening, which is part of a long series of talks where we invite brilliant researchers, thinkers, and writers from all around the world, and also from our own university, to discuss contemporary topics of great interest. My name is Lars Mogensen. I'm a radio journalist, and I've been asked to moderate this discussion, this debate about an issue that I think that we just might be taking for granted in Sweden. Democracy. Many of us tend to think of democracy as something as natural as clean water from the tap. Well, maybe it's not. And maybe we shouldn't take clean water for granted either. Now, if we talk about democracy, there are challenges to democracy all around the world. And the Research Institute Varieties of Democracy, VDEM, just published a report saying that for the first time since 2001, autocracies are in the majority. Autocracies are countries that are not democracies. Autocracies are in the majority. 92 countries, home to 54% of the global population, live in not democratic countries. And this is clear in parts of Europe, Poland and Hungary. And if we look at American democracy, many observers do highlight several threats to American democracy over the last 4 years. And you all know that it's election day tomorrow. So we got plenty of things to talk about here tonight. And our headline reads, "Is democracy in danger, or are we crying wolf?" That's in Swedish, "Är demokratin i fara, eller ropar vi på vargen?" So with me tonight I have 4 brilliant participants who will help us sort these things out. We got Pippa Norris in the United States, Ivan Krastev in Bulgaria, Karin Svanborg-Sjövall in Stockholm, and Jan Theorell in Lund. So Pippa Norris, you're at Cape Cod at the Atlantic coast in Massachusetts. How are things there?
Things are cold, and the election is tight, and we're all excited by tonight.
You are Pippa is an Anglo-American comparative political scientist who's taught at Harvard for many decades, and she's written tons of books. Please, Pippa, present yourself a little bit more.
So I've been at Harvard now for many years. I'm basically a writer, written on many different topics in democracy, including issues of how to strengthen democracy, how to think about issues of electoral integrity, how to work on issues of gender equality and inclusion, how to think about participation, and a variety of other issues like communications.
Okay, thank you. And we have Ivan Krastev from Bulgaria. You are usually working in Vienna, Austria, but I understand you are now in the Bulgarian countryside. How are things there?
Listen, Bulgarian countryside is fine because it's beautiful weather still, 17, 18 degrees. It's a very depopulated area, so it's nice to be there, but to be there for a long time, even if it's a nice place, you want to move.
You're longing to go back to Vienna. Ivan is a political scientist and author of books such as After Europe. Many people have heard about it and read it. The Light That Failed. Please tell us a little bit more about your works and what you do.
No, I'm also doing some work in democracy. I'm staying also with the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where I'm a permanent fellow, and I even basically has a very short book that I published, which was basically out in English just 3 days ago, which was very much on some of the early political consequences of the first wave of the COVID-19. So basically also trying to see what is going on.
I like the title of it. Is it tomorrow yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic. Yeah, I think we might be talking about that too. And Karin Svanborg-Sjövall in Stockholm. She's been working at Timbro. But please present yourself. You're a journalist. You're writing about populism.
Yes, that's right. Up till July, I was the director of Timbro, which is a big think tank based in Stockholm. But now for the past few months, I've started a new life. I write columns for Dagens Nyheter, for instance, but I'm also working on a book about populist statecraft in Europe. I'm supposed to travel. That has become a bit of an issue, but I've done a first study in Denmark, and hopefully I'll be able to go to Austria in early spring.
Okay, we're all stuck behind our screens now, but We'll have to live with it. And Jan Theorell, he's a political scientist and democracy researcher at the University of Lund. Jan, you're close to us, but not in the same room. You're at home. You're at your office. Please present yourself a little bit more.
Yes, thank you. I'm a professor of political science here at Lund University. And I study what we call comparative politics. So that's politics in different countries, mostly democracy and democratization. But I've also studied corruption and state building, how you build a state, on a broadly sort of a global level, but also particularly recent years, more and more in my own country, in Sweden.
And you are also the founder of the VDEM that I mentioned, Varieties of Democracy, that we will probably get back to. Now, just to start easily, I was thinking about asking you, how worried should we be about democracy or the future of democracy? And this morning I ran into an article written by 80 researchers in Europe and in the United States. It's been quoted by Washington Post and The Guardian. The headline says, "How to Keep the Lights Open in Democracies." And they write, they say, while democracy appeared to be flourishing everywhere in the years before and after the Cold War, today it seems to be withering or in full-scale collapse globally. As scholars of 20th century authoritarian populism, fascism, and political extremism, we believe that unless we take immediate action, democracy as we know it will continue in its frightening regression, irrespective of who wins the American presidency in November. So getting back to you, let's say we have a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is a lot. How worried, Karin, should we be about democracy?
I have this contrarian streak in me, so I would say 3.5. Probably, I would say there is absolutely cause for concern, but not for panic.
Okay. And Ivan Krastev, on that same scale, how worried should we be, according to you?
I was reminded of this old Jewish joke about a husband who sent a telegram to his wife, and the telegram read, "Get worried, details to follow." And I do believe it captured well the state in which we are.
There is more to come. Okay. And Pippa Norris, how worried should I be?
Well, if we look historically, there have always been waves of democracy and democratization and then authoritarianism. Huntington says in the 1920s, democracy went down. In the 1960s, democracy went down. So the third wave from the 1970s was clearly a forward advance. And in historical perspective, you would expect that there could be a plateau or a decline or backsliding after a certain period.
So are we in such a period now, a backslide?
We're certainly in a plateau. The number of democracies around the world hasn't been expanding, and we can certainly see signs in many countries that are going backwards, whether it's in Hungary or Poland, whether it's in Venezuela or Mexico, whether it's in the United States and Britain. So in many places.
And so where did you end up on my stupid scale then?
I didn't.
And how about Jan Theorell? How worried should I be?
Well, I think I need to distinguish between the short run and the longer run. In the short run, I might venture a 3, but in the longer run, I'm not that worried, a 1 or a 2.
Okay. So in the long run, things will be better. That's optimistic. We'll hear more about that. I've asked you to sort of paint the basic picture or choose part of the big picture that you find most interesting when we speak about democracy and whether democracy is in danger. And take 3, 4, maximum 5 minutes and tell us about what things you see. Would you like to start, Pippa Norris?
So thank you. So right now we're so obsessed with the election in America, and I think most people are as well. So I've been trying to ponder what the outcomes might be so we can kind of set that in context. And the way I came up with it was thinking there are 3 scenarios. And what happens in America is going to affect the world in all sorts of ways, and then the future of democracy. So the first scenario, democratic landslide. Biden gets in. All the polls are saying that he's got a 7% lead or so, and that should mean a clear win in the Electoral College. And the Democrats may even gain the Senate under that basis as well. So if we look at various forecasts, that's certainly decisive wins in Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona would put us on that path. What would that mean? Well, it would really mean that there still would be a legitimacy crisis because of the Republicans, because so many people who are following Trump still believe he's going to win. They don't accept the idea that that the election could be honest and fair. So they're still going to question it. And particularly one part of the Trump coalition is made up of white supremacists who are very extreme, sometimes armed, and a lot of conspiracy theories are circulating with misinformation. So the best case scenario for the first case is that Biden wins with a solid majority, gets the Senate, and of course holds on to the House, and brings in a whole range of democratic reforms. In other words, the crisis becomes an opportunity, just like Watergate was. And that could be really positive because there's a range of institutional changes that need to happen. Second scenario is darker. Second scenario says the polls are wrong and that instead of a clear win, it'll be tight, it'll be close. And essentially, there could even be the situation like in 2016, where Biden wins the popular vote, Trump still wins the Electoral College vote due to the position of the states. And that would really lead to a fundamental challenge. There could easily be certain states that move in different directions. The polls can be inaccurate. There can be shy Trump voters when people ask. And any legal problems are going to come up for challenge. There's 300 different challenges in the courts right now about how the process should work. You don't even agree about the rules of the game. Accusations of fraud, accusations of votes being stolen, accusations of voter suppression on the other side. So chaos and mistrust is most likely from that situation a prolonged outcome when we don't know the result very clearly. And of course, now with the Supreme Court, which is 6-3 right wing in terms of its appointments. And so they could confirm a Trump Electoral College victory, even if there are fundamental questions. So deep rancor, that's the second scenario, and more polarization. The third, I'm sorry to get so black, but the third is even worse, which is, I call it lock them all up, which is that Donald Trump and his administration gets back for a second term after winning the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. That's entirely possible. The polls, again, can be wrong for all sorts of reasons, particularly if Biden's national lead falls to about 2 to 3%. He still won't get the White House. And so in that case, what we'll see, I think, is an emboldening of authoritarian populism, already there in so much of what Trump's rhetoric is about, but rather incompetently often followed through, but still fundamental limits on civic rights and civil liberties, problems in media freedom and independence, misinformation expanding, corruption in government, further party polarization, and polarization then, in that case, in the Democratic Party will move rapidly towards the progressive wing and who will be social unrest because people are so mobilized and anxious and would really claim that the election had been stolen by the Supreme Court because of the most recent appointments and the stacking of the court. So 3 different outcomes. We're not going to know which is going to happen. We won't know probably tomorrow midnight. It'll take some time. The first one basically says there's a crisis, but it becomes an opportunity for democracy and democratic reform, long overdue in America. The second one says, hold on to your hats, but it's likely to be mass demonstrations and for a long period, it's kind of Florida on steroids. And the third one says democracy is not going to continue in the United States, which is a very bleak scenario, not predicted by the polls, but is out there as well.
Thank you, Pippa. Those are 2 out of 3 very dark scenarios, but we'll keep them in mind and we'll get back to that when we dig into the US elections a little bit more. Thank you very much. How about Ivan Krastev in Bulgaria, who's written so much about Central Europe and how people value democracy there? What is your big picture?
Listen, of course, there is a very high level of dissatisfaction also in Central and Eastern Europe. But what is very important if you're going to see the crisis of democracy from kind of a much more peripheral places like Bulgaria or Central and Eastern Europe is to imagine that when we had a political problem some years ago, the common frame was this can never happen in the United States or the United Kingdom.
Right.
And now we saw that it can happen. And from this point of view, I was always basically, it's not how many countries are in crisis. There's a slightly difference if the democracy is in crisis in the UK and US, or is it in crisis in Bulgaria and Serbia? In a comparative case, In both cases, you have two countries in trouble, but basically it makes a huge difference how it is perceived. And what is interesting from my point of view is to try to see also what we are seeing in the United States is teaching us about the crisis of democracy in general. And the first is that basically democracy is not a voting. The problem of the contested elections, the problem of the integrity of the electoral process, this is becoming a reality everywhere. I do believe we're going to see a proliferation of contested elections. Years ago, Albania was a place in which I do believe in the last 30 years only twice the party that lost the elections recognized the results. Now I do believe that we can see Albania going global. And this is a major issue because in a certain way, democracy is about not simply people voting, but the losing party recognizing the result. The second thing, which is also critically coming from places like Hungary and Poland, is that while we're asking people in the surveys and others about the rule of law, everybody's going to tell you 65% that they support the rule of law, that they support independent courts, they support independent central bank. But the story is in a highly polarized society. What we see with some of these nationalist populist parties, they're voters who otherwise probably really like the rule of law, but they're not going to punish their leaders for violating the norms because for them, the biggest threat for democracy is the other party winning. And I do believe this is something that is happening in some of these countries. And I found this critically important because if you believe that the biggest threat to democracy is the other party winning, all this talk about impartial institutions, all this talk about basically neutral institutions, it doesn't hold. You're not going to do it. And the third thing, which is very important in the United States, and I do believe in a different way, I see it in Central and Eastern Europe, it's going to be in Europe in general, is that demographic anxiety is also part of the explanation of the many things that we're seeing in our countries. Basically, you have an ethnic majorities, which because of decline of the population, because of shrinking numbers and others, are facing a reality in which they try to see basically that their majority status could be lost. And this is an interesting story because don't forget, in democracy, numbers matter. And the fear of being outvoted created a situation in which certain type of a representative of this, what I'm going to call threatened majorities, try to basically use the institutions in order to be sure that their power is going to stay, nevertheless, what are going to be the democratic changes and demographic changes. And I do believe this is quite important. We talk a lot about the new media environment. We talk a lot about technologies. But my feeling is, and this is Central and Eastern Europe, very much fits to what we see in the United States. The relations between demography and democracy is something that is understudied. We don't know how basically different societies react in a situation in which you basically see a major demographic changes because of, by the way, different relations between generations, migrations, others. So the idea that probably some of the newcomers are going to outvote you creates this type of a panic. And I do believe that President Trump basically captured it very strongly when in 2016, in one of his rallies, he said to the Republicans, if you're not going to vote for me now, you're never going to be basically winning elections anymore. And this time that this apocalyptic view that these elections or the next elections is going to solve how the future is going to look like. This I find particularly kind of threatening and dangerous in the whole discussion that we have.
When you mentioned that some groups fear that the biggest threat to democracy is the other party winning, it's a very strange way of looking at things, but does that include Democrats in the United States fearing that Trump will win again?
No, listen, this is very important. I do believe that there is quite a lot of difference in the way that leadership of the parties are going to react. But I was seeing a survey, which I'm sure that the others also have been seeing it. You can see that a lot of very high percent of the college students said that they're not going to recognize the elections if Trump is winning because they don't believe it's going to be a fair elections and they're going to be a fair win. So from this point of view, this is not just the one side.
And so that fits into one of the scenarios that Pippa just painted where there is social unrest or maybe violence on the streets. Thank you very much, Ivan Krastev, in Bulgaria. And how about Karin Svanborg Sjövall in Stockholm? you've been writing a lot about populism. You come from Timbo, a liberal think tank. What is your big picture when you look at the threats to democracy?
Well, again, as I said before, I'm essentially an optimist. I don't think there is anything inevitable about a development where we slide towards autocracy. But in a way, I'm as concerned about the response to authoritarian populism as I am to the parties themselves. If we go back just 4 years to 2016, the last time that the United States went into an election, the US was ranked as a flawed democracy in the Economist Index of Democracy for the very first time. And it's important to remember that this was not because Donald Trump was elected. It was because of pre-existing low levels of popular trust in government and in the parties. And if you look at the expected turnout in this election, it actually looks like he has increased political participation quite a bit. And the same goes for other countries in Europe where you see authoritarian populism, that it has mobilized voters that have basically stopped caring about politics because they didn't feel that they had any representation. So if political participation is your only metrics, then the challengers to the old elite and to the old parties could be said to have invigorated the democratic system. Parties have no right to any number of voters. And I can actually understand why it looks an awful lot like the behavior of a cartel when the establishment tries to keep new parties out. And that's because it's partly true. But that said, I do think that there is an obvious cause for concern, not for democracy as such, as in majority rule, but definitely for liberal democracy. And that is partly because, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, liberal democracy also promises negative freedom from politics, not just to politics. And partly because discretionary values-based politics, in the kind that we see waged in the cultural wars, is very difficult to reconcile with rules-based politics, since it is not there to protect the individual, but rather to promote a specific collective. So in essence, I do have confidence that present liberal democracy as a model can strike a balance between conservation and change, but it's fairly obvious that we haven't found it yet. And I do think we're getting a bit pressed for time to do so.
Okay, so it's high time to do something. And it's good that you mentioned and you did stress that we're talking about liberal democracy, which is not just going to vote. It's the rule of law, it's independent institutions, it's free media, free journalism. It's rule of law, so that's important to keep in mind. And I would also like to remind the viewers that if you have any questions, any comments that you would like to send us, we'll try to pick up some of them. Then you go to this address here, www, it's fun to say that quickly, www.menti.com, and enter the code. You can read the code. And just send us your comment or your question. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Karin. And Jan Theorell, as I mentioned, you are one of the founders of the VDEM, the big democracy research institute with people all over the world doing research. What is your picture of the things that we're talking about?
So I'm going to portray a slightly less bleak picture of the state of democracy in the world. Of sorts, sort of providing a counter-narrative to this dominant story about autocratization and democratic decline that we hear so much about right now. I should say right away, though, that this story will not take the pandemic into account, because I will talk about four findings in the VDEM data, which still has no data for this year. First thing, and I might come across here as the dull academic, but I think it's important to point out that the decrease in the global level of democracy over the last decade is within the margin of error. So if we take these basic institutions, so electoral democracy into account, so free and fair elections combined with these very important freedoms, expression and organization that are required to make elections meaningful. Looking at the global level of democracy, it has decreased by 2 percentage points. So on a scale from 0 to 100, so it's from 54 in 2012 to 52 in 2019. And if you add these important also liberal democratic institutions, such as constraints on the executive, broader set of civil liberties, the drop is pretty much the same, from 42 to 40. But as with all serious scientific mapping exercises, you need to take measurement error into account. And if you do, there is no trend, actually. The change is within the margin of error. However, and this is my second point, if we take population size into account, the downturn is statistically significant. So the democratic decline that we have observed mainly affects larger countries. Think about India, Turkey, and also the United States. Until this was discovered, though, particularly by some of those who like to sort of cry wolf, the standard in the field was not to take population size into account, but to count each state equally. And there are pros and cons on both approaches. It's just important to acknowledge that the choice in this important sense does make a difference. Moreover, this negative trend, to the extent there is one, is not discernible across the globe universally. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the trend was upward all the way through 2018. In Asia, it actually still is. In the Middle East and Northern Africa, we're basically back to the level where we were prior to the Arab Spring. So what is primarily driving the downward trend is Latin America and the post-communist countries in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics. So again, this is not to imply that democracy in some countries is more important than in others, but I think there is a slight risk in our parts of the world that we give too much weight to the negative development in sort of countries in our geographical proximity, such as Hungary, or large countries and influential countries such as the US, that we then forget about the positive news from far away, such as in Tunisia or Sri Lanka or in other places.
What happens with that risk if we speak too much about Turkey or Poland or Hungary and we forget whatever countries that you mentioned in North Africa? Are we getting a twisted picture?
We're getting it's twisted picture. I think we're risking that the decline is mostly in our heads and that we don't actually look coolly on the data and at looking at it globally. And I have a fourth point, if I just may. And that is that not all facets of democracy are affected to an equal extent. So universal suffrage, for example, is not in decline. Nor is constraints on the executive, nor is judicial independence, which you might think if you look.
What does that mean, constraints on the executive?
So basically that the legislator can exercise control of the over the executive, question the executive, hold the executive accountable for wrongdoings, stuff like that. So that is not in decline. It's actually slightly upwards. What is mostly affected, and this sort of paints a slightly different picture than the one you've heard from previous speaker series, is certain freedoms. So, and again, they are not unimportant. So freedom of information, freedom of the press, and to some extent, freedom of organization. Those are the parts of democracy that are mostly in decline. Looking at history, when democracy went into a big slump in Europe in the interwar period, or in Latin America in the 1960s, early 70s, we saw a very different kind of autocratization. Coup d'etat, they wholesale replaced elected governments, and sort of liberal democracy was nullified. That is not what we see today. So I think these comparisons with the past should be done with great caution.
Yeah. Can I ask you, you're free to comment on each other now too, but Ivan, if you want to start, when you listen to Jan saying that decline, if you look at it globally, it's another picture. Are we committing mistakes if we talk too much about what's going on in Poland or worrying about Turkey, etc.?
No, I very much agree that, and particularly in my case, basically all my expertise is very much on Europe. But there is also one interesting story. If you go many of these kind of surveys, when they basically fixed Hungary as having a problem with democracy, which was basically the year, I know much more, the Freedom House basically surveys and others. So in a certain way, many of our instruments are not really well prepared for getting a sliding of the quality of democracy. we basically see easily, because if you have a coup, when the elections are going to be dismantled and others. But also what I do believe that there are other kind of trends which are interesting. And one of them is that basically, particularly, unfortunately, in the Western Europe and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, satisfaction and support for democracy is particularly low among the younger generation. And to be honest, also it is much lower, of course, according to the last study which this new Cambridge Center on the Future of Democracy showed, compared with any of the previous cohorts. So in a strange way, basically you have a dissatisfaction of how the system works for different reasons and so on. So it's not simply the quality of the institutions, but in my view, the most kind of a challenging thing is that the border between the democratic and non-democratic regimes is not well protected.
Yeah, Karin was nodding.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. And I was sort of alluding to that a little bit when I said, that we need to strike a balance between sort of conservation and change, because obviously, I think populism and authoritarianism is in many ways a result of there being real disaffection out there that needs to be dealt with in some way. But the big problem, I think, with painting too gloomy a picture really is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because sort of the very basis for democracy functioning and being legitimate is that people actually believe in it, that people believe that we have the best system there is to be had. And if that confidence is too low, then it's going to be very difficult to defend it.
Okay. Jan, and then Pippa.
Yeah, I totally agree with Karin on this, and I would put it even more starkly. I think as social scientists, we should admit to something, and that is we're really bad at forecasting the future. We've never done it, and I'm not sure we will ever be able to do it. So basically, when we're talking about what's going to happen, it's up in the air. And I know this from my own study of democratization. It's very difficult to predict from one year to the other what's going to happen in a country. And it's well known in many other fields as well, even in economics. Economists can hardly predict growth. So what does this mean? Well, it basically means that whether you should be an optimist or not is not an empirical question. It's not that you can be correct or not, looking back at the data and say what's going to happen with democracy. Whether you want to be an optimist or not is then a moral question.
Oh, yeah.
And morally speaking, it's much better if we have optimists walking around than if we have pessimists.
But we need your knowledge to orientate in this world. What does Pippa say?
So we have to remember what VDEM measures, and that's very much one aspect of democracy, which is about the formal institutions. It's about the constitutional structures. Is the franchise expansive or is it restrictive, and things like that. So it doesn't measure another key dimension, which has always been there ever since Armand and Weber, and of course work on the breakdown of democratic regimes by Lintz and Stefan, which is the cultural aspect, which is about our attitudes, as we say, and how far people either support democracy as an ideal, in a principle, is it the best form of government, and how far they approve of its practice. And it's particularly, if the practice is a problem, then of course people should be critical of it. That's not an issue. But if people feel disillusioned with the ideals, and there is some emerging evidence for that. For example, the World Values Survey is just finishing the 7th wave. So I looked at that data. We have a question, do you approve of having a democracy in your country? We have 43 countries which have asked the same questions in the 1990s, 2000 and 2010. And what you can see is that worldwide, we've got about 43 very diverse societies. It's gone down a bit of those who say it's very good or fairly good to have a democracy. It's gone down in America. 90% said that in the 1990s. Today it's 84%. So there's an erosion of popular support for the ideal. And the same is even more true if we ask, do you approve of having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections? Now that for me is a real signal of authoritarian values, of a feeling that democracy isn't working, there's stalemate, there's gridlock, so we have to really turn things around and throw that out and just go for a strong person leader. And there, the proportion in the world is a minority who approve of that according to our evidence, but nevertheless it's gone up. Yeah. So again, in America, this is quite striking. The proportion who think that having a strong leader is very or fairly good was a quarter in 1990, it was a minority. It's gone up to a third, 37% today. And amongst Republicans, it's even higher.
Okay.
So people are frustrated, basically.
Yeah. It's easy to get lost in all these numbers and figures, but I hear you saying, people, that there are more people now, longing for a strong leader in the United States. And I would like to ask Ivan, if we sort of concentrate on your part of the world, or Europe, Central Eastern Europe. You've written several articles and books about what happened there. There was so much enthusiasm with the democracy during the late 80s, early 90s, when the wall came down. Why is enthusiasm for liberal democracy, why is it going down? Because I guess that's what it's doing. It's coming down in that part of the world.
Listen, first, when you're going to talk to many of these leaders, which basically we're going to define as nationalist populist leaders, they don't have problem with democracy. They're not against voting. In a certain way, they like voting because they're winning elections recently. They have a problem with the liberal part of the liberal democracy. Basically, they have a problem with the constraints on power. They have a problem with, and this is quite important because what is on the rise in Central and Eastern Europe is not a kind of a classical authoritarianism. You have a democratic majoritarianism. And when you see basically the idea of the liberal democracy, there's three kind of things that are quite important for it. On one level, of course, you have the right of the majority to decide who is going to govern the country. And this right is not threatened to the extent that basically nobody in Central and Eastern Europe is going against elections, and basically elections is the only source of legitimacy. The second is the right of property, and basically here you're going to see in places like Hungary or Poland, probably the trust in capitalism is much higher than in the United States, particularly among the younger generation. But the third is about the rights of the minorities. And here, basically, the situation is very different. And I do believe that democratic majoritarianism is very difficult because it functions in the institutional frame of democracy. This is not simply an authoritarian leader, it's a popularly elected authoritarian leader. And one of the major attacks that come from Central and Eastern Europe was that it was in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1990s that all this, and I very much agree with Ian that we are not great at predicting, and basically future is the invasion of the unknown. But in a certain way, certain type of expectations have been created. And all the idea of the democratization was basically born out of the experience of Central and Eastern Europe. And then the problem, what went wrong? And what is interesting with what went wrong is that people are going to say it's economy stupid. But this is not such a strong argument. Look at Poland. For the last 30 years, Poland is the fastest developing economy in Europe. It's not simply that GDP is going up, even the social inequality has been declining. And to surprise of many, more than 70% of the polls in a consequent surveys are declaring that they're satisfied with their personal lives. So populism is not simply the mobilization of the losers of the economic reforms. They are losers. And there are major social inequalities in our societies, but in case of Poland, it doesn't work. And the cultural explanation that basically this is kind of a new democracies which go back to their kind of patterns of behavior from the pre-war period. Listen, but dependency always has a certain power. But I do believe that there are other things. And as I told you, at least in my view, what we are seeing very much is that Central and Eastern Europe has one important characteristics. This is ethnically the most homogeneous part of Europe. Listen, this is the paradox of history. Go back to the year 1900, and if you see the ethnic map of Europe, you're going to see two Europes. There was one that was quite ethnically homogeneous, and this was Western Europe. And there was one that was basically very much culturally, religiously, ethnically diverse, and this was the Habsburg Europe. And then comes this 20th century, two world wars, revolutions, expel of populations. In 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were non-Poles. In 1995, 95% of the population of Poland were Poles.
So ethnic homogeneous, but you've also, yeah.
Yeah, because in my view, this is quite important because in a certain way, what we see is very much a cultural backlash. And to a certain extent, both in Hungary and Poland, the populist parties are cultural parties. The economic policies, by the way, they very much differ. And Polish Kaczynski party did many things that normally social democrats should do. And Mr. Orban is different, but the cultural aspect of this, try to preserve the ethnic nature of the state, the ethnic nature of the society, making ethnic homogeneity the only source, basically, of the legitimacy of political power. I do believe this is quite important in order to understand where support for these parties come. And also, like in many other places in Europe, the rural-urban divide is the most important one that we see.
Urban divide and ethnic questions. Jan, you were waving.
No, sort of three reactions. I think this is a really important discussion. And first is this distinction between sort of the cultural aspects of democracy, what the people think and want, and the institutional ones. It's, of course, very important. It's though, also important to acknowledge that sort of the connection between the two is not as straightforward as we sort of generally tend to think. So it's not sort of as easy to say that there is uncontrovertible evidence showing that if support for democracy is strong, you will get more democracy, or democracy will not decline. It's not like that. So this is a very hotly debated issue, whether the cultural and the institutional aspects really hang together. I also wanted to say that I think the sort of the liberal versus illiberal democracy, as it's sometimes called, and a lot of people like to cite Orban on that account, is sort of a game of words. You cannot attack certain liberal institutions, such as freedom of expression, freedom of the press, without attacking democracy itself. So you cannot go on being sort of a democratically elected autocrat, at least not in the long run. So I think it's partly a play of words.
So illiberal democracy is a contradiction.
Yeah, so yes. Yeah. There is no illiberal democracy. Yeah, Orban is attacking democracy, not only liberal democracy. Thirdly, and I think this is very important, what Ivan says about sort of the expectational part of democracy. And this, if we look at this long run, is I think one of the problems democracy has in the world, that we expect too much of it. We think that democracy should solve all our problems. And not only us in our parts of the world, but even more so in the parts of the world where they still haven't experienced democracy, or at least not so much of it. So just come democracy and, you will get out of poverty and you will get order and you will get peace. And that is not the case, at least not in the short run. It takes a long time for democracy.
Can you say that? Can you say that to people in? Can you say that to people in Belarus or Turkey or wherever democracy is under threat? That you're expecting too much.
I can tell them that you should wish for democracy. Because it's better to live in a country where you're not persecuted for your political opinions than the one where you put to prison for it. It's better to live in a country where you can actually hold your leaders accountable. And in the end, in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, they will want to hold Putin, Orban, and Erdogan to account for the wrongdoings. It's going to happen sooner or later, and it's better to live in a system like that. But don't expect that democracy will give you all the other material benefits, at least not in the short run.
Pippa, we expect too much of it. We expect too much of democracy.
We do, absolutely. Because often, in many countries that don't have the experience, they often think, I'd like to be democratic. When you ask people in the Middle East and Africa and so on, what they're really thinking about is, I'd like a state that works with public services, with stability, with security on the street. So they look at what is seen as Western democracies and they say, I'd like that. They don't necessarily understand the nuances of what is democracy. And when you ask people about things like, well, the army should step in if the democracy fails, they can agree with that, along with saying, yes, I want democracy. So people are kind of contradictory. I wanted to come back also, though, to Ivan's point, which was about cultural backlash, which, of course, I very much support from our book. But I'd like to ask whether or not you think it's not just about ethnicity and nationalism, it's also a broader sense of cultural backlash. So, for example, you think about Poland, think about abortion rights and the current massive demonstrations, the pushing back of women into the home to some extent with COVID. You think about issues of tolerance of LGBTQ rights as well in Hungary and in other socially conservative countries. So for us, the backlash was broader than simply about ethnicity, although that's critical. It's about anti-foreigners, it's about anti-Europeans and globalization. It's also about anti-other groups, others, us versus them. Do you think that's true of Central and Eastern Europe as well?
Absolutely. And in a certain way, they're very much connected, because part of the war on the women comes from the fact that if you want to keep this ethnic homogeneity, you start to be totally obsessed about the low fertility rates. Yeah. And you start basically to blame the women. And part of one of the war on the LGBT people is what you're doing. Because of you, we don't going to have the Poles that we need, or the Hungarians that we need. What is interesting is basically, I do believe that paradoxically, it's not simply a clash between diversity and homogeneity, but a clash between two different ideas of homogeneity. On one level, basically for this national populace, homogeneity means cultural homogeneity. We are together, we have come together, and basically we should keep it because this is the distinction of our political community. And Mr. Orban has this famous saying that Hungarians should be in the way they have been 10 centuries ago. He had a very long memory, obviously. But the story is that most of these parties on the other side are strongly attacking the liberals, that they're promoting a different type of homogeneity, political homogeneity.
This is correct.
Yeah, saying, listen, you are ready to live with people who are ethnically different, racially different, religiously different, but to the extent that they basically share your views.
Yes.
But you're also totally intolerant towards people that have a different views. And in my view, what is really in crisis is this basic consensus in the political community that we have differences, and democracy is about basically making these differences visible, but also reconciling these differences. Okay. And from this point of view, I do believe President Trump was extremely indicative on one thing. If you compare him to the previous American presidents, good or bad, for them, of course, the Democrats were the opponents if they're Republicans, but they were not the enemies. The enemies was outside of the borders. If you see even on the 2016 elections, some comments on foreign leaders, for him the real enemy is the Democrats and the other is just the opponents. Basically the idea that the only war that matters is the electoral war. And I do believe we are seeing this in different places, and part of it is globalization. By the way, part of it is the absence of the war in part of the Western world, where you have a population. So democracy is also suffering also as the result of its successes. It's not simply the result of its kind of a failures. But I very much agree with you. It's not about ethnicity only. It's not about religion only.
But that question, what you're saying, Ivan, brings us into polarization. There is a huge polarization in different various countries. Where does that, well, you've already touched upon the subject, but where does that polarization come from? And you've been talking about it too, Pippa, the risk of having social unrest. How would you describe that?
So the way that we explain it in the book is a long-term trend. It's about the rise of liberal beliefs in many, many issues, whether it's about gay rights and marriage, and whether it's about issues of gender equality, or whether it's about globalization. And those trends expanded in the population. So more and more people started to adopt those liberal values from their earliest years. And the problem is that the social conservatives are the losers from that. Those who believe that there should be a nation and patriotism versus a European Union. Those who believe that we should preserve Christianity versus a kind of a secular values. Those who believe that women should have a traditional role rather than having gender equality. And that group essentially used to be the old majority, and they're increasingly being pushed back. And when you get a leader who can say, I can speak for your values, and your values are right, your values are good, your values are the ones which are part of, quote, America or France or Britain, as we saw with Brexit, then you've got a very potent combination. You've got that demand amongst social conservatives who are essentially on the wrong side of history. They're losing out over time. The Liberals thought that they'd won, for example, under Obama, only to find that conditions went the other way in the election. And that is what leads to this tremendous polarization. Because it's not about issues you can cut up. It's not like, for example, taxes versus spending, a little bit more on this, a little bit less on that. It's about your identity, who you are, who you see yourself, and what values you should have. And those are things which is incredibly difficult to compromise on. And populism is about us and them. It's about good and evil. It's about you're in my tribe or you're in your tribe, and neither side will talk to each other. It's a decline of pluralism and bargaining. So polarization, and it's worse, by the way, in a winner-take-all system. That's the last point.
Karin, what do you say about polarization? What has made us become so angry and divided? Because that's happening in Sweden too. It's a harsh language, etc.
People basically just made my point. I think, and I do think that it's very important, the fact that identity is a very dangerous conflict to choose from a political perspective, because there can be no scope for compromises. And I remember I made an interview with a liberal in Hungary and I asked him, so how are you going to go about this? Because Orban is he's chosen his electorate, which is the rural voters and the older voters. And this liberal was out and he was getting the young and the urban voters. And I was asking, so how do you propose to sort of, to get this country to sort of mend back together? I mean, if this is sort of, it's identitarian from the beginning, how do you strike compromises if these are sort of, you're just basically representing different in-out groups? And he had no sort of good way of explaining that. He was saying that I want to be Macron. I'm going to be the Macron of Hungary. But it's going to be very difficult for a Macron of Hungary to reach out to rural voters and to find sort of common ground with them. So I think the demographics really do play a very important part here. And that's also, I think that, going back to, sort of valuing the left-right divide is something that is extremely underrated. Because we can all be dissatisfied, but it's not the end of the world, and it's not a personal insult.
Yeah. So going back and holding on to the left and right scale would make things clearer and less. Yeah. Okay, Jan.
No, I just wanted to add to this. I completely agree, actually. I think a pretty important distinction between ideological or policy polarization on the one hand and effective polarization on the other hand. So a lot of the polarization that is going on in the US, for example, is not necessarily, or at least not only about having the taking different stands on policy issues, lower or higher taxes and so on and so forth, but it's about sort of not wanting to socialize with people from the other party, not wanting your children to socialize or marry with people from the other party. So it's about hatred.
But where does that come from?
So it comes from both directions. So it comes from below, but it's also, of course, fueled from above. And this has been very clear in the U.S. over the last years with the president they've had. But it's also clear in the Swedish case. We don't see it as much in Sweden, but the way the Swedish political parties take a stand toward the Sweden Democrats has played into the same kind of frame. So it's a question of whether you should touch them or cooperate or even talk to them or not. And it's very much phrased in ways that don't talk about, at least not only about different opinions. So the main difference in opinion would then be about their migration policies, but it's framed in much more broader terms than that, and it becomes effective. So it's fueled from above, but of course, the voters also support this. So it's a negative spiral. It comes both from above and below.
Thank you. Let me just take one of the several questions or comments that have come into menti.com. I'll show you the number soon. But one of the question reads, and let's direct this one to Ivan and to the European frame. Is there any period in history that is comparable to what we can see now? That's a question from one of our viewers. Is there any period in history that is comparable to what we see now? What do you say, Ivan?
Listen, I do believe that we all the time compare. This is the only way we can think. So paradoxically, all the periods are comparable. And I'm not the one who believes that we're in a period which is very much close to the interwar period. It's a different game. And one of the interesting story about being a different game is that if you start to see and compare the current populist parties, for example, with the radical left or the radical right in the interwar period, there is, in my view, one important distinction that we are not always kind of underlying. Both the communists and the fascists, they have been radical parties that didn't like the people in the way they are. They wanted to change them. They have the idea of a new man. They have a different idea about the new man, but it was a pedagogical project. There was the idea of the future. The interesting story about the current populist parties is that their major message to the voters is, I don't want to change you. I like you the way you are. I'm here basically to serve you. And from this point of view, this is interesting because when we talk about where this polarization comes from, Listen, it comes from the fact that both the market, the internet, all this is empowering us to self-select the people with whom we are communicating. Mm-hmm. Before, it was the state that was mixing people. The state was people when you have basically have the conscription. People from a very different walks of life will push to be together. The schools. And now you more and more, and in the United States, it of course can be very easily seen when you basically see also the physical separation of the voters. So strangely enough, if you listen to what Macron was talking about after the killing of the French history teacher, he started to talk about separatism. Normally, separatism is about territory. But now we have a different type of a separatism in which all these tribes are living next to each other in the same political community, taking part in the same elections, but really basically is back to each other. And from this point of view, of course, this is very different. And this is different because we have much more the easiness to separate each other.
Yeah. So
economically, technologically, communicatively. And when we say how comparable and comparable, I want to end up on this because COVID-19 is the biggest social experiment, at least that we go through in our lives. And it is going to transform a lot of things. Even the fact that we talk to each other kind of in the way we're talking now, we don't know what is going to be the long-term impact on the way political society works.
Okay, we'll get back to COVID. Thank you, Ivan. We're living in our different bubbles now. That's evident. And I direct the same question to you, Pippa. Is there any period historically that is comparable to what we are seeing now in the United States, or that we've seen the last years?
Well, I mean, there's so many issues of social conflict over the years. It's nothing brand new in America. We can go back to civil rights and think about the 1950s and the ways in which African Americans were on the bridges and being killed by the police. We can think about the 1960s and the race riots and the issues of the war on poverty and Johnson and the assassination of leaders in the United States. We can think about the 1980s and think about in Britain, Thatcher, and the ways in which the coal miners were mobilized, and there was anger on the streets then and massive protests over poll taxes. And we can think about, what's going on now. So it's not that conflict and so on has always been nicely contained into electoral boxes, and we've all been these wonderful kumbaya tolerant, groups of people who would come together. There've always been cleavages. But I think the distinction is very much, as we say, that it's about identities which are very difficult to change because they are who you are. They're how you shape yourself. And issues of class that used to be the politics of the 1950s, again, you can put some more money into welfare systems or into health or into education, and somebody else can cut taxes, and you can still have a pluralistic agreement, a kind of bargain, right? And the parties then were often in the center of the ground after the Second World War. Nowadays, of course, basically negative partisanship means if you like me, you hate the other side. If you hate the other side, you like me. And I think in Europe, it's less problematic in a proportional system like in Sweden, where at least parties have a voice through the parliaments, and so they have some platform. But if you're in a winner-take-all, you've got this us-them, and then it's either you win or you lose, and then a presidential system as well, and it's a recipe for heightening the risks of conventional politics spilling out into something else.
Thank you, Pippa. We have a question for you, Karin, and it says, as you observe it, Karin, many of us are worried about the response to Trump as by Trumpism itself. How can we explain to anti-Trumpers that they are a problem too? Do you understand the question?
Yes, I think I do. Well, I think people who believe in pluralism need to understand that they need to set an example for themselves. It's one thing to be in favor of pluralism in theory, but if you are, you should probably try and be in favor of it in practice as well. And this is something that I think liberals like myself need to be reminded of quite often, that, it's easy enough to talk about, tolerance. And then you meet someone who say things that you think are abhorrent, and the sort of the gut instinct of most human beings is that you just want it to end, just want it to stop. And I think if we could have a public conversation about the fact that pluralism and tolerance actually means something in practice, it requires something from you. It requires courage, it requires confidence, it requires guts, and also, of course, boundaries to mean something. But it's just become this sort of phrase that we keep on using that we don't really reflect what it means in essence. So I think that's an important chore.
Jan, you're nodding.
Yes, no, I think that was a good response. I mean, going back to what I said it before, tolerance is another way of expressing that sort of way of combating effective polarization. But of course, if you have a leader who is not tolerant, well, what can you expect of his followers? So that's, of course, something that is, it's to put high demands on the voters. That's why what leaders do in this sense is very important.
And there are limits, right? There are limits on that issue. For example, should I debate QAnon as though somehow there's some rationality to this weird conspiracy theory about sex pedophiles in the Democrats? Should I tolerate white supremacists who argue that, that all sorts of reasons, there's tremendous racial inequality?
Colin.
Yeah, no, of course not. But there's a big difference between tolerating something and accepting something or endorsing something. I think the problem is that we keep mixing these sort of different terms up all the time. That tolerating is just that you have to, if you live in a society that is pluralistic, you will just have to get used to the fact that there will be idiots everywhere. and there's very little you can do about it.
But so you can choose from calling a conspiracy theorist person an idiot, or you can talk to her. I mean, and talking to her, you sort of tolerate and accept what she's saying.
Yeah, and of course you should debate with them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's dangerous to think that we should always strive to find a consensus, because it's being part of a free society is that there should be no consensus. There's no point in freedom of discussion if that's the case.
Ivan, on tolerance.
I'm very much on this because I do believe this is going to be a huge issue, and it is not going to die with Trump, because the cancel culture is very strong also on the left of the Democratic Party. And the problem is that if you are basically canceling everybody else, we are going back to the idea in which the other is not simply wrong, he's morally wrong. And when the other is morally wrong, basically just talking to him is becoming an issue. But there is one major change, and I find it because conspiracy theories is not only in the United States. In the 2015 parliamentary elections in Poland, the answer to the question who predicted best who is going to vote for Law and Justice Party was not about economy. It was not even about culture. It was about what happened with the plane that crashed and where the President Kaczynski died. Those who believe it was assassination, they're going to vote for the government. Those who believe it is not are going to vote differently. I'm saying this because I do believe we see a kind of a transformation of democracy of citizens into a democracy of fans. If you see, and from this point of view, of course, President Trump is a classic, he really treats his voters as a fans of a football club. Mm-hmm. Citizen is critically disposed to his own leader. So you're basically criticizing, you keep accountable your own leaders and others. While the football fan is very emotionally connected to basically the leader, but criticizing your own is not part of the game, exactly because it's identity. Because with everything that you're doing, you're saying who I am, whom I want, how I want to be perceived by others. And there was an interesting study being done by YouGov in the United States called The Tribes in the American Politics. And it was critically important also to see how two quite small groups of the American public has captured the debate. And this is also something where the new media structure, the new social media is keeping an incredibly important role. 97% of all political tweets in the United States are coming from 10% of the tweet users.
That's an interesting theory, Ivan. We're going from democracy of citizens to democracy of fans. Pippa, does that fit in your picture?
No, absolutely. Because when you look at the rallies, always so much emphasis by Trump on the numbers, and how everybody's so enthusiastic, and this call and response, which is so characteristic, that the crowd will say something, lock her up, and he'll amplify it, and that'll go back into his next speeches as well. So it's a symbiotic relationship, but the crowd has got nothing to do with public policy. They don't determine the role of the leader. They don't have any role in there was no platform in the Republican Party. They abandoned it this year. So there's no sense of any programmatic engagement as there used to be, for example, in social democratic parties, when the mass membership would actually play a role in the leaders and choosing the platform as well. Now it's much more a supporter, somebody who's going to come along at risk to their own health, by the way, support the leader, endorse them, and be against the other side, no matter what they say. That's very much their role. And indeed, you can actually almost see it rather like a church or the religious tradition in America of the evangelicals, and it's kind of call and response. That's very much what's happening.
Ivan, you've touched upon this question before. COVID-19, the pandemic that we're all suffering or having to deal with worldwide. You would think that such an enemy would be suitable for certain strong men and strong leaders to have a new enemy to fight. But how are populist leaders or authoritarian leaders, are they benefiting from the COVID situation, would you say?
No, my feeling is, and listen, we are in the middle of a crisis. Basically, making comment on the end of the war before the war is over is one of the stupid things that somebody can do. But there was quite a lot of expectations in the beginning that the populist leaders or even authoritarian leaders are going to benefit a lot from this crisis. And to be honest, my argument always was that paradoxically, people are slightly also misunderstanding the psychological source of populist support. Populism is not rooted in fear. It is rooted in anxiety, which is a very diffused fear. You basically fear everything. You want somebody basically to express your resentment. But when the real fear comes, the fear that you're going to be affected, the fear that your beloved are going to die, then you're not looking for somebody to express how you feel. You look somebody to solve problem. So as a result of it, it was governments benefiting on the first wave. It was not the populist leaders. And when it comes to the classical authoritarian leaders like President Lukashenko or President Putin, China is a different case. It didn't work for a very simple reason. And the major story is that the most important freedom every authoritarian leader wants is the freedom to choose the crisis on which they want to respond. They like crisis, but normally the crisis that they have produced themselves. And from this point of view, this is such a total crisis that you cannot replace it. And as a result of it, it didn't work well. As I said, it's different, and China is, of course, a different case, at least for the moment, but I don't believe that Mr. Lukashenko benefited much from the basically neglecting the crisis. And if you see also in the case of Russia, this is one of the crises in which President Putin didn't do well. There was this empirical correlations, which shows that in a certain way, the countries being led by women are doing better than by men. And one of the reasons is at least the women are not framing this as a war, because defeating a virus and being kind of successfully the victorious about the virus probably made a good speech on the first day, but already in the middle of the crisis didn't look very promising.
Yeah, and I think it's an important distinguish that when you distinguish between fear and anxiety, that is important. Can I quote you? You wrote somewhere in an article that anxious people are loud and angry, while fearful people do not have the luxury of anger. So that changes the way that people act.
Yeah, listen, in the Russian prisons, one of the most polite people, the most senior type of a criminal, so-called вори в законе, who never swear to each other when they talk to each other, because simply the words has consequences. If you're going to basically swear the other one, he basically should kill you. So the problem, part of the populist talk is that you have a very strong words, but in a certain way, most of them basically does not have much more of a consequences. And this is what is changing in a crisis like this. You basically cannot be simply loud at a low cost.
Okay, Corinne.
I think it's very difficult to talk about one populist response to. I've seen it done in many articles, but I mean, of course, whether you're in government or not, obviously plays is a very big factor to what extent you respond to it or whether you benefit from it or not. But I think one interesting aspect is that regardless of the short-term effects for individual parties or governments, I do think that this crisis will play a part in the way that politics is conducted afterwards. Mainly because it forces not least liberals to concede something that they have not really been willing to concede before, which is that for years and years and years, you've had sort of anti-establishment parties saying that they want to do a lot of things that liberals have said simply cannot be done. You cannot halt globalization, you cannot stop immigration, you cannot stop free trade, you cannot exit the EU, you can't do all sorts of things because they think that they would be bad things to do. But they haven't even responded sort of in why that would be a bad thing. They just said that it cannot be done. And for the past few months, we've seen politics do all these things. It was possible. So I think it forces the establishment to return with better arguments that they have in the past.
Jan.
No, I just wanted to add that although the word is, of course, still out, as Ivan said, we're in the middle of the war, so we shouldn't comment on it. I think that a worry is that the pandemic will leave lasting effects in certain authoritarian settings where you can sort of prolong state of emergency eternally, more or less, where you can use this crisis as a way of sort of basically reinforcing your power grabs. We will see that in many countries, also in democracies, but not to the same extent and much more temporally.
But we're not seeing.
But again, we don't know, because the crisis, this is similar to economic crisis, and an economic crisis could be really sort of bad for democracies, but it could also be really bad for autocracies.
But as I understand, Ivan, we're not seeing it yet. We're not really seeing that the populist leaders are taking advantage of the situation the way.
I think we are seeing it. Yeah. They're trying to, but will they succeed? That's another question.
And it is also interesting. I do believe if President Trump is going to lose the elections tomorrow, one of the effects of his defeat is going to be that we're going to see the Populist Party becoming much more nationalist in the way they're responding, very differently. For example, in some countries, they ended up as being on the street protesting restrictions. In Sweden, as I understand, they went to ask for restrictions. So in a certain way, they're positioning very differently, because when the Trump came, there was this moment in which they had the feeling that there was a global populist moment. Of course, very much it was about migration. There was quite a lot of mimicking of what worked in places like the United States and United Kingdom. So now I do believe it's going to be very much taking the strong position, and I very much agree with Karen that the idea that there is no alternative, that certain things cannot be done, it's not there anymore. And one of the impact of the COVID-19 is that on one level, it's going to strengthen the nostalgia of the people for the pre-COVID-19 world, even people who didn't like it before. But secondly, it radicalized the imaginations of certain social groups. If you're radical environmentalists and you always wanted all the planes to be landed, you never believed that this was possible, and it happened overnight. And if you're a radical nationalist and you always wanted all the borders between the EU member states to be resurrected overnight, you hope for this, but you never believe it's possible. And it happened overnight. So what is possible and what is not possible is very much changed politically by this pandemic. And I agree very much. This is going to be one of the impact in the way politicians should do politics.
Pippa Norris, would you like to comment on that too, in
yes,
COVID-19?
I saw a very nice study which looked at the early effects of populism on the measures that were taken to close down, basically to lock down, using the Oxford Stringency Index. And it certainly showed that populists in general were much slower to act during March and were much more reluctant to act during April as well. The real question, though, is why? And I find that fascinating. So particularly if you think of a Bolsonaro, if you think about a Johnson, or you think about a Trump, they were all very reluctant to really intervene. Something like a mask doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to be a symbol of either freedom or non-freedom. It can just be seen as a piece of cloth that you wear on your face. And yet it became this symbol in the early stages because of the way that they framed the issue. Trump could have got on the other side of COVID, basically. He could have said, okay, we're going to put lots of money into this. We're going to really improve through the government all the schemes that were available to cope with the unemployment and so on. And he just got on the wrong side of everything. And it's partly the populist suspicion of experts, i.e. scientists. That's part of it. He's most recently said he's about to fire Fauci, one of the most admired men in America right now in terms of scientific epidemiology. But there are other things, I think. It's also partly the masculinist nature of the campaign and the way in which these leaders saw themselves as on one side, that wearing a mask was somehow feminine. It wasn't something they could do because they wanted to project an image of strength and so on. But I still don't think we know the full reasons why these populists have taken such unpopular and incompetent policies from a very early stage, not acting when they could have acted to their own benefit, and what the drivers of that really are.
Let me ask you, Pippa. Ivan already mentioned that he thinks that Trump is going to be defeated tomorrow. I'm not going to ask you all what you think because, as Jan said, he's not.
Yes, we can
he doesn't want to answer
because it does not have consequences.
Yeah. Anyway, a question for you concerning the scenarios that you stated earlier, Pippa. The outcome of the U.S. election. In the light of these three scenarios, it will, of course, have a great domestic impact in the U.S. But how do you think, will there be a spillover from these effects on other democracies around the world?
Yes, I mean, insofar as America is always seen as the headline story, both in supporting democracy worldwide and human rights in the past, ever since Woodrow Wilson through to recent years, even though in its practice, it's obviously not necessarily followed that line in its rhetoric and in its support for USAID and a number of other agencies, it's always been at the forefront. So if democracy is not seen as so critical, but we can essentially have alliances, not with our friends, but with a variety of other regimes from Saudi Arabia to Russia, then that's going to put a dent into international attempts to strengthen democracy. And that's what we're seeing at the United Nations. When I go there, the amount of resources, the amount of priority, everybody's on the back foot who was concerned. I used to work at the UNDP for a while, and I was there at the highlight of this from 2002. And people were very much, this was a new area, it's expanding, it's exciting, and more resources went into it, particularly from Scandinavia, but also from many other countries. And now when you visit the United Nations, everybody's saying, well, you know, things are being cut back. We're moving back to other issues, and we have to defend what we have. And that's also true of gender equality. Again, I've just come back from a United Nations meeting on preparing for the status of women. And again, everybody's in a defensive crouch, saying it's anti-gender movements who are on the streets. It's movements back on reproductive rights and on women's rights. COVID is accelerating this, but there are many other indicators as well.
Yeah, and Jan Theorel, with your global binoculars, what do you think? How will the outcome of the elections in the United States affect the rest of the world? Of course, it depends on what happens in the elections, but are there big effects?
No, I think, I mean, if Biden wins, as Pippa says, just the amount of money that will again be thrown at democracy promotion will increase radically. And of course, that's not the whole story about how democracy develops in the world, but it does matter on the margins. It has been shown. So that in itself is important. But also, of course, just the symbolic effect of Trump losing will matter. Autocrats, they learn from each other. And now, yes, I'm calling Trump an autocrat, but and I also think a lot of autocrats they do think of him as such too, and they will try to see what what kind of mistakes he made, and that will also matter. Finally, not only economically but just culturally, the United States is so incredibly important. And I can just speak of my own country. When we had election night in 2016, we had more students attending than we had for the US presidential election than we had for the Swedish national election in 2018. It just says something about the enormous interest in the United States, which of course is partly cultural, that they dominate our media. They make the serious. They make the music our kids listen to, and that will matter what kind of president they have.
Sweden.
But we also have standard drama. We invest in that as well. So
That's good.
and Borgen.
Sweden is supposedly one of the most Americanized countries in the world. I'd like to ask you, you don't agree totally, which is good, on how serious these problems are for liberal democracy, but let's say vaccine is a very important word these days, but is there a vaccine against authoritarian tendencies? How do we mend what was broken? Is there a vaccine? What does Karin say against authoritarian tendencies?
No, unfortunately, I don't think so. I used to think that, as long as you had a very strong and good constitution, that was maybe not a vaccine, but very close to it. I think what we've seen in the past 10 years or so is that sort of that kind of institutional setup isn't enough, that there needs to be values in place respecting those institutions for them to actually be a proper vaccine. They can sort of delay bad things, but they can't prevent them from happening in itself. No, I think probably, there are probably two very difficult things that are the best things to do if you don't want to have these sorts of tensions. And one is to ensure that government delivers, that it doesn't promise things that it cannot keep, that it works, that democracy works is a good start. And the other is, of course, that you try to avoid shocks of different kinds, which is hard because there will always be shocks. But that seems to be a sure recipe for.
So if the government delivers a wall towards the other nation, or the government decides to put certain groups in jail, they deliver.
Well, there are those who think that would be enough. I'm not one of them. I think the fact that you have a government that is able to that isn't perceived as weak is important, but that isn't the same as saying that it's necessary for a government or a state to be repressive for it to be strong. But the fact that it's perceived as politicians are just squabbling, that there is a lack of energy, a lack of will to actually solve problems, that is something that democratic politicians will have to take upon themselves, because the less functioning a government you have, the stronger the appeal will be of the idea of strongmen out there, people who can have it done.
Okay, and Jan, what is your advice? What do we do? How should we think or act in order to get rid of, maybe it's an exaggeration, but to handle authoritarianism?
So no vaccine from my side either. I'm sorry, I would have loved to be able to prescribe one. But going back to what we talked about before, I think lowering our expectations. So learning to value democracy as a good in itself, and not only as something that is good because it gives you something else, material benefits, order, what have you. So I think this sort of what the late Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander once called the discontent of rising expectations. I think that is pretty much behind a lot of the problems we see with democracy around us in the world today. And those expectations need to be to stop rising.
And Pippa?
So I think you've got either culture or institutions, and culture is something that's very difficult to change. I mean, it's one of those things that evolves over time. It's like a river. You can't really shift it one way or the other. Over time, I do predict in the book that basically that older generation of rural men and others who've lost out from liberal values are gradually going to decline in the population, and young people in the younger generation are getting mobilized, they're getting active around issues like climate change, we haven't even mentioned, or other issues about a more tolerant country. And that group is gradually going to ascend into a larger group. So over the long term, one can see these kind of tensions moving away from this tipping point to a more broad acceptance. But the institutions you can change. And the institutions, in particular, I'd argue that consensus democracies, some of the key things that we always have in Scandinavia, but also in many other European and other countries, are things which we really have to learn from in majoritarian countries. It's where you get us, them populism plus winner take all, like in Brexit, where you get this bitterness where people won't even talk to each other, their families get divided, and communities and parties as well. When you have at least some accommodation through the rules, which is a wide range of different rules, then I think it can help. And some of the longest established democracies are weakest at changing their rules because they've had them for such a long time. They kind of take them for granted, whether it's India or whether it's Canada or whether it's Australia or whether it's Britain or the United States. Newer democracies have innovated, and we need to learn from that to bring some of their best ideas through and to be open to new ways of doing democracy. It's not a static thing, it's an evolving thing. But we can change the institutions in ways that can be effective.
And Ivan, you grew up in Bulgaria on the communist side of the wall, the not so democratic side. You've been writing about the age of imitation, trying to explain why the enthusiasm for democracy is falling in Central Europe. What are your thoughts? How should we handle the threats to democracy or rise of authoritarianism?
Fateful on two things. What I remember, and I was 25 years old in 1989, so I remember a lot. In the communist countries, the communist elites believed, because their system is more progressive in their own views, that the very fact by being communist countries means that nevertheless, that basically they're run by idiots, the system is going to prevail. And this was kind of a very strong historical argument saying, see, everybody's saying how dysfunctional the Soviet Union was, but it defeated Hitler. Taking the very fact that you're a democracy as a kind of a competitive advantage, which is enough to solve any problems, in my view, is a big issue. It's enough to see some of the empirical data on the response to the first wave of COVID-19 to see that the nature of the political regime does not explain best which countries did better than others. There were democracies that did well, and there were authoritarian regimes that did well. So from this point of view, this is the first two. But the second one is, I'm afraid that we are very much in the business of defending democracy, and defending democracy is, people believe, preserving it the way it is. Democracy is going to change. By the way, according to most of these type of a kind of a classifications that we have, the United States before 1964 is not easily going to be classified as a liberal democracy. So from this point of view, of course it's going to change, and it's going to change in different ways. So I'm going to end up saying that for me, it is quite important to remember that democracy is an experimental type of regimes. You're experimenting. Certain things work, certain things failed. And one of the biggest problems in Central and Eastern Europe is that in 1990s, experiment was a dirty word. We basically believed that we had enough of experiments, so we were in the business of copying. But copying is also an experiment, but experiment that you're not aware of.
And so we will have to keep experimenting with our democracy, whether it's the democracy of citizens or a democracy of fans, as Ivan mentioned. Tomorrow is election day in the United States. Ivan thinks Trump is going to lose. Anybody else who wants to comment on that?
The previous time, 2016, I believe he was going to win.
What does Pipa say? What happens tomorrow?
I go along with the forecast, right? And they say basically the Real Clear Politics predicts Biden-Harris wins 368 to Trump-Pence with 170 votes. Whether that transpires depends on the states, the polls, the voters, fraud accusations, how the courts resolve. I mean, there are so many unknowns. Nobody would actually say that that's going to be the result, who has any caution, whatever.
We're ending with that forecast from Pipa Norris in Cape Cod on the Atlantic coast. Thank you very much, Pipa. Thanks, Ivan Krastev, Karin Svanborg Sjövall, and Jan Theorell for participating. And thank you very much, all the viewers that sent us questions. I've taken some of them. There are several that we didn't have time for. It's been very interesting to talk to you, and thanks for watching. There will be soon new debates here at the University of Lund. Thank you for participating, and thank you for watching.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.